that there is this, and always has been to some degree, this elephant in the room called religion, whether it's the role it played in the social gospel tradition, or whether it's the role it plays in the current government, or whether it's the role where it plays in American politics, or whatever. That over time, people have lost the ability to talk about, and it's such an important influence on how certain groups and individuals behave that we need to be able to talk about it. We need to not be discouraged from talking about it by the sort of common sense, well, church and state, you got to keep them separate, politics and religion, they don't mix, all that sort of thing. I think keeps us from thinking clearly about what is actually going on. So I see what Dennis is doing, and what I'm trying to do in my book, although mine's a bit more of a political memoir, is to say, no, this is important. We've got to get this right. And those of us on the left, on the religious left, we were talking just before I came up here. There was saying about keeping what was the word, sort of low key. Well, those of us on the religious left, I think, have become so low key that the religious right has not only been able to dominate the scene, but they've been able to create this unfortunate perception in the public mind that the only connection between politics and religion is on the political right. And so if for no other reason than historical and current accuracy, there's a need to correct the record and to help people know, so they don't have this sort of stereotype of religion that it's only produces politics of one kind, that there are all kinds of people of faith on the left. And this is what we've done in the NDP by creating the Faith and Justice Commission, and we had that workshop in Quebec City in 2005, where we were competing, and when you have a noon workshop at an NDP convention, you're competing with about 15 other meetings. And we had about 150 people come out and to hear James Loney, and I made some introductory remarks. It was like this huge coming out party. Everybody said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" "Well, I'm an Anglican." "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm a Mennonite." "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm a Unitarian." "What are you doing here?" "Well, and I didn't know, So we've been kind of keeping it from each other, never mind keeping it from the world. So, and so we're trying to create a venue within the party so that people can talk about that, but also so that we can communicate to the rest of the world that, it's okay to be both. It's okay to be religious and political.
I didn't talk about Islam here, but there are a number of pieces in my book which deal with it. The one that most comes to mind right now, because we're approaching Remembrance Day, is I think it was in 2009. I attended at Library and Archives an event called Potlucks for Peace, where Jewish and Palestinian people get together, which they do once a month. But every once in a while they have an event which they open up. And that particular night, the Palestinian doctor whose daughters were killed by an Israeli tank shell, I believe, was there, Dr. Abuelesh. And it was an extremely, extremely moving event. This was in November. His daughters and niece had been killed in January. And it was really amazing for him to say that this had happened, but he simply was not going to hate. There are other things in the book about Islam. I'll hope that people will read them. But I feel that I know less about Islam than I do about Christianity, but we all have to know more about Islam. Well, I think for one thing, thinking in our country is influenced by a lot of things now because of, the media is ubiquitous. But I do think that there has been quite a lot of crossover. Certainly, the border is no border to television, let's say, or to televangelism, things like that. But I think there have been other things go on as well. Focus on the Family, for example, which is a strong group in the U.S., is organized in Canada. It's not exactly the same organization, but it's an offshoot. And in Washington, they have a kind of a family research bureau, and there's been one of them set up in Ottawa, so there's some similar practices in that way. I mean, it's true of evangelicals, but one would obviously have to say it's true of Catholicism as well. which is an international religion. And I think it was the very hard line that the American bishops took, saying that any politician who supported same-sex marriage or abortion or didn't oppose it even could be denied the sacraments, and that began to happen up here as well. So when you talk about the religious right or religious conservatives, that happens across different groups, but certainly it does happen. Do you have anything on that, Bill?
Well, I mean, they are influenced individually by, in some ways, by what's going on in America. But I mean, we have our own homegrown religious right here in Canada, and you know, we've got Preston Manning with his Manning Institute for Democracy. He's a self-admittedly, you know, out there training conservative religious activists. I mean, he doesn't make any bones about it. He says, you know, he's teaching them to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So this is a whole new take on that particular scripture. But and I look for opportunities to debate Preston on that. But he was invited to come to Winnipeg and for a lecture that's going to happen next week, but he couldn't make it because I did have an opportunity to spend an evening with Preston once at his invitation, and we kind of debated the two social gospels, as he likes to call them, because there is at least with Preston, he wants to kind of claim the social gospel tradition, and there's to some degree the social credit movement was regarded as a social gospel in its own right, at least in the 30s when they when they still were social credit, as opposed to just sort of becoming another conservative party. But they're big on. Well, all I'm saying is we've got our own indigenous tradition, and we shouldn't. It's not just the American thing. We've got our own indigenous tradition. That's all I'll say for now.
Someone whose creation has been in charge of a science portfolio or the equivalent.
Well, I think you have to judge people on what they do. I once, when Stockwell Day was getting a terrible time, legitimately so, some years back, a journalist said something that I found rather interesting. He said, well, why has he been given such a difficult time? There's all sorts of politicians of every stripe who believe in the virgin birth, and it's not that much more difficult to contemplate that than it is some of the science theories. So I think we have to get into a whole other discussion about what religion really means to people and how literally they take it. So I can't comment specifically on Mr. Goodyear, but I just think that it's pretty tough to be hugely judgmental when we have some things of our own. The question for those who didn't hear it is that I look at any religious organizations who spurn political action, don't want to be involved. They have been influential in their own way, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses through court cases. Actually, no, not in the book, because I tend to be looking at who is political rather than who isn't. I could tell you, though, as a little aside, my grandparents became Jehovah's Witnesses when they retired, which was really caused some disruption in the family, because I came from a Catholic community, but my maternal grandparents were Ukrainians and Greek Orthodox, and their daughters, including my mother, married Catholics. And at the time, if you married a Catholic, you had to become a Catholic, and they did, and they became better Catholics than people like my father. But when my grandparents became Jehovah's Witnesses, it really, as my mom used to say, the fur really flew, and people were very unhappy. But they lived in a neighboring town called Waka, and I discovered later on when I went into politics and was door knocking, when I would door knock in that part of town around the Jehovah's Witness Hall, people were always unfailingly polite, but they said they were interested in a higher power than people like me, and so I would sort of go to these places and think I got to get out of here and keep going because I'm wasting my time. But no, I did not look in the book at that. But I do recall reading Thomas Berger's book Fragile Freedoms, in which he has chapters about the padlock laws in Quebec and the way in which the Duplessis government treated Jehovah's Witnesses, and the way they went to court to fight for their religious freedom and won. Bill's been around longer and may have other examples, but those are ones that come to mind.
Well, I just, the person that came to mind when you spoke was John Howard Yoder, who kind of, there's an Anabaptist tradition of disentanglement from politics, and which sort of is very, very critical of I think, a lot of the theology that would accompany the kind of involvement in politics that you would find in the social gospel or in liberation theology or in a variety of other places. So it's not just the total sort of abstentionism, if you like, of Jehovah's Witnesses. There are other theological traditions, particularly Anabaptist, but not only, which would, well, and Catholic, I mean, I remember, and I talk about this in the book, meeting with, that's not mine, oh, no. Anyway, just ignore it. Daniel Berrigan, Philip Berrigan. I remember having a debate with Philip Berrigan one night when we had a house church, manual students. There were about 7 of us, and we invited the Berrigans, and Phil Berrigan came, and he had no use for politics. He said that, he'd only voted once for a socialist candidate for mayor in Detroit. For him, it was all the beast and Babylon, and the only recourse was civil disobedience and prison. And I remember having this debate with him about the political process. And he said, "Well, wait, way go. If that's what you want to do, I respect that, but I'm telling you." And when I heard that just some years ago now, just before he died, that he was in prison again, because that was his vocation. And I don't mean that, I mean, that's what they did. And I wrote him, and I said, remember me, I spent the last 25 years in politics against your advice. And I always say he was kind enough not to write me back and say, well, did you think you were wasting your time? But anyway, my point is, there are a number of traditions within different religious streams where people have had, I think, respectable critiques of, the value of engaging. It's not, I don't agree with them ultimately. I think we do have to engage. I spent my life doing that, but it's not just Jehovah's Witnesses.
Juliet's giving a wrap-up cycle. That's fine with me, but there's a final thing I would just like to mention that I was hoping to work it into an answer to a question, but it didn't work out that way. There are a number of younger people in the room, which is lovely to see. Some of them are friends of mine or friends of my daughter Anna's or my daughter Maria's, and I'd like to thank you especially for coming. And I'm not sure that the discussion, the debate exactly speaks to you, perhaps. Maybe it does. But I think there's a whole lot of thinking and talking to do about what's happening now and where people are finding ways to plug in ways that are important to them and that they find meaningful. And I don't know, for example, when there's an action on Parliament Hill and some people get arrested over the pipeline debate, if those are mostly younger people. A lot of them are, when I see television clips, when I see who's in the tents in Toronto and everywhere else. They tend to be younger people, so I think there's a really important discussion to have, and it doesn't have to be, I guess, only about religion as maybe we have always conceived it, but it's interesting and important to hear about faith and spirituality as they conceive it. So I want to acknowledge your presence here and apologize if we haven't quite hit some of your buttons, but let's keep talking, okay?